Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.
Hey, great to be here.
So, to truly evaluate the concept of an all-powerful God, which is obviously a central debate in atheism and theology today, you actually have to look at God's ultimate adversary.
Right, you really do.
Today, we are exploring how the ultimate villain was, well, constructed to solve the glaring theological plot holes of human suffering. We're going to trace how a celestial middle manager in ancient Hebrew texts evolved into a red guy with a pitchfork.
Yeah, quite the glow up.
Right. And we'll see how modern religions use this figure as the main protagonist to basically control their followers.
It's a really profound historical journey. I mean, we're looking at a character who doesn't even get a proper name in the opening acts of the biblical text.
Yeah.
Yet somehow this figure becomes the absolute linchpin for understanding how millions of people navigate their daily lives, their existential fears, and, their basic understanding of morality.
Exactly. And to guide us through this, we're pulling from two really fascinating sources today. The first is a rigorous historical and linguistic breakdown of the Bible by Nils Glenn, who looks at how the original text evolved over centuries.
Yeah, really dense, fascinating stuff.
And the second is an insider's look at the theology of Jehovah's Witnesses by the YouTube channel XJW Panda Tower.
Right.
And our mission for this deep dive is completely impartial. We are not taking sides on whether God or the devil is real. We're simply unpacking how the idea of a cosmic adversary evolved to solve the problem of evil and how that idea impacts the daily lives of believers. Also, real quick, if you like my channel, please subscribe and hit the like button.
Always appreciate the support.
Okay, let's unpack this from the very beginning. Because if we really want to understand the devil, we actually have to start with the original concept of God.
Right.
Long before a devil figure even existed.
Yeah, so if we look at ancient Israelite theology specifically, before the Babylonian exile, the understanding of God's sovereignty was just absolute. God caused everything. There was no competing cosmic force holding the bag for the bad stuff.
So God was doing both the good and the bad.
Exactly. For instance, in the book of Isaiah, chapter 45, verse 7, the text explicitly states that God forms the light and creates darkness.
Wow.
Yeah, that God makes peace and creates evil or calamity. God was viewed as the direct, undeniable cause of both the blessings and the disasters.
Which is the exact problem of evil that fuels so many atheist arguments today. I mean, if God is in charge of absolutely everything and God is fundamentally good, why is there childhood illness?
Right, exactly.
Why do catastrophic natural disasters happen? If there is no adversary to blame, then the logical conclusion from those early texts is that God is the direct author of all human suffering.
And that tension is precisely what the ancient texts eventually had to wrestle with.
Yeah.
Because in these early writings, there was literally no character named Satan.
Nothing.
Nothing. The Hebrew word they used was Hasatan. And Hasatan is not a proper name.
Right, it's a job title.
Exactly. In Hebrew, the prefix ha functions as the definitive article, much like the word the in English. So you wouldn't introduce someone as, the Michael or the Sarah.
Yeah, that'd be weird.
Right.
Yeah.
So Hasatan translates literally to the adversary or the accuser.
So originally, Satan was basically God's prosecuting attorney, or perhaps like a middle manager doing performance reviews.
That analogy actually captures the dynamic perfectly. If you look at the book of Job, which historians consider one of the oldest texts in the Bible, the Satan is simply a member of the divine council.
Right.
He is a celestial being whose specific job is to patrol the earth and just report back to God. He is not living in some fiery underworld. He is standing right there in the heavenly court, basically clocking in for his shift.
His role there is essentially to test human loyalty, right? He tells God, like, Job only loves you because you gave him a comfortable life. Take it away and he will curse you.
Yeah, exactly.
He is functioning as the cosmic skeptic. But how do we get from a skeptical middle manager in a divine council to the ultimate cosmic scapegoat who embodies all evil?
Well, the turning point is historical trauma, specifically the Babylonian exile in 586 BCE.
Okay, set the scene for us.
So the Babylonians invaded. They destroyed Jerusalem, burned the temple to the ground, and just deported the population.
Jesus.
Yeah, for the Jewish people, this event was catastrophic on every conceivable level. Imagine you are an ancient Israelite living through this. Your entire world is decimated.
Right.
It forced their theologians into a profound crisis. They had to ask themselves, how could their perfectly good chosen God cause such horrific, prolonged suffering?
They needed a theological solution to explain the suffering without making God the villain.
Exact.
They needed a scapegoat.
And you can actually watch this theological shift happen in real time within the Bible itself. It's across 2 different books describing the exact same historical event regarding King David taking a census.
Yes. This blew my mind in the sources. So, in the older text, 2 Samuel, which was written before the exile, it says that God's anger was kindled against Israel, so God incited David to take the census.
Right.
And because taking the census was considered a sin, God then punishes Israel with a massive plague that kills 70,000 people.
Which is incredibly problematic from a theological standpoint.
Yeah, I'd say so.
The text literally has God forcing David to sin and then massacring the population as a punishment for the very sin God initiated.
But then, hundreds of years later, after the profound trauma of the exile, a new author rewrites this exact same history in the book of 1 Chronicles. And 1 Chronicles says Satan stood up against Israel and incited David to take the census.
The linguistic shift here is the key. In 1 Chronicles, the definitive article is dropped.
Oh, right.
It is no longer has Satan, the title. It is just Satan. This is the very first time in the Hebrew Bible that the adversary is treated as a proper personal name. Yeah. The writers essentially externalized the evil. God was still sovereign, sure, but this new, separate entity was now responsible for the temptation and the resulting suffering. It was a theological mechanism built specifically to protect God's reputation in the face of immense tragedy.
The scribes literally edited their own history to invent a scapegoat.
They really did.
Which makes me wonder if ancient scribes formalized the scapegoat to protect God's image, how does that exact same scapegoat mechanism function when a modern institution with millions of followers puts it into practice today?
Well, the source from XJW Panda Tower provides a really detailed case study of how this theology functions in practice.
Yeah.
Within Jehovah's Witness theology, Satan is not just a scapegoat. He is functionally the main protagonist of the entire biblical narrative.
That sounds completely counterintuitive for any Christian denomination.
It does, yeah.
But the source lays out the logic step by step. In their theology, Satan initiates the plot in the Garden of Eden. And because Jehovah supposedly did not foresee this rebellion, because, foreseeing it would make God responsible for the ensuing suffering, Satan essentially forces God's hand.
Right.
God is reacting to Satan, just scrambling to come up with a 6,000-year backup plan.
And to understand why a 6,000-year backup plan is even necessary, we have to look at a concept they call universal sovereignty.
Okay, what is that?
In this framework, Satan didn't just challenge God's sheer power, he challenged God's right to rule. Satan claimed that humans would be better off governing themselves without God's interference.
Ah.
And the primary analogy that Jehovah's Witnesses use to explain God's response to this challenge is the teacher and the rebellious student.
Okay, let's hear the analogy.
They explain that God is the teacher and Satan is a student who stands up in the middle of a complex math lesson and claims he knows a better way to teach the class. If the teacher just punishes the student immediately, the other students who represent millions of observing angels, by the way, might think the teacher was simply afraid of being proven wrong. They might think the student actually had a point.
So the teacher steps back and lets the rebellious student teach the class just to prove to everyone how terrible the student is at it. Meaning, God lets Satan rule the earth for 6,000 years, resulting in war, disease, and death. Just to prove a philosophical point to a celestial audience of angels.
That is the core of how they solve the problem of evil.
Wait, if a teacher lets a student teach the class but then keeps stepping in to actively punish the students, like God supposedly did, by flooding the earth in Genesis or striking down entire cities in the Old Testament, the analogy completely falls apart.
It really does.
The teacher isn't letting the experiment run organically to see if humans can rule themselves. The teacher is actively sabotaging the classroom.
Right, yeah.
And honestly, it brings us right back to evaluating the concept of God. Does creating a 6,000-year theater of human suffering just to prove a point to your staff of angels make a deity look perfectly just or deeply insecure?
Well, the logical consistency of the analogy is certainly debatable, but the utility of this doctrine doesn't lie in its flawless logic.
Right.
The utility lies in its sociological function. When you elevate Satan to the active ruler of the current world, you create a very specific, highly regulated reality for the believer. You construct a worldview where unseen forces are constantly at play.
And according to the XJW Panda Tower source, this cosmic bet isn't just an abstract philosophical idea discussed on Sundays. It dictates almost every single action a believer takes throughout their week.
Yeah, What's fascinating here is how strictly they enforce boundaries. In the Jehovah's Witness worldview, they use a scriptural framework divided into the table of Jehovah and the table of demons.
Just black and white.
It is a strict binary. Anything that falls outside the direct approval of the church leadership, whether that is outside entertainment, higher education, politics, or other religions, is automatically assigned to the table of demons.
The source material detailed some striking examples of what this looks like on the ground. We are talking about beliefs where demons can attach themselves to physical, inanimate objects.
Oh yeah, everyday items.
There's the widely circulated story within the community of a Smurf doll that supposedly became possessed by a demon and walked out of a kingdom hall.
Yeah, a walking Smurf doll.
Or the official animation the church produced where a mother forces her young son, Caleb, to throw away a plastic toy wizard because, as she explains, Satan really likes magic.
What is important to analyze here is the mechanism of social boundary enforcement.
Right.
By convincing followers that demonic forces are actively attached to mundane objects, thrift store furniture, or outside media, the religion ensures a profound level of isolation.
Because it's a literal threat.
Exactly. You don't just avoid outside information because you disagree with its premise. You avoid it because bringing it into your home might literally invite a demon to harass you or your family.
The source mentioned people attributing sleep paralysis, bad luck, or even serious mental health struggles to simply having a demonic trinket from a garage sale in their house. And it extends far beyond thrift store items. It dictates how they are required to view other human beings.
This is perhaps the most potent application of the Satan concept we see in the sources. It serves to completely invalidate the external world.
It provides an infallible shield against competing ideas. Like, if a Catholic or an evangelical Christian tells a Jehovah's Witness, hey, I had a profound life-changing vision from God, or I felt the Holy Spirit speak to me.
Right, they don't even have to consider it.
The Jehovah's Witness doesn't have to wrestle with the possibility that this person's faith might be genuine. They simply attribute that profound spiritual experience to a demon playing an elaborate trick. How incredibly convenient is that?
It creates a closed ideological loop. A believer never has to engage with the actual substance, theology, or emotional weight of another religion's claims if they can instantly categorize their divine experiences as demonic illusions.
Yeah.
The concept of Satan, in this context, functions as a wall that keeps the believer safely inside the group's specific interpretation of reality.
It is an incredibly effective psychological structure, but here is where it gets really interesting.
Oh, the history.
Yeah, this intense modern fear of the devil, the apprehension over Smurf dolls, toy wizards, and thrift store items, is largely based on medieval artwork and layered linguistic translations, rather than the original biblical text they revere.
Yeah, let's look at the actual linguistic evidence from the Nils Glenn source to understand how that happened, because it's wild.
It really is.
If we go back to the inciting incident of all this suffering, the story of the Garden of Eden, the antagonist is identified as a serpent. But the text of Genesis never calls this creature Satan.
Not a single time.
No. The Hebrew word used in Genesis 3 is Nahash. And Nahash is a fascinating linguistic triple entendre in ancient Hebrew.
Okay, break that down for us.
It simultaneously means serpent, it means enchanter, or one who practices divination, and it means shining one.
Let's just sit with that for a second, because this completely shifts the picture of the Eden story.
Right.
It wasn't just a literal talking garden snake hanging from a branch. The ancient writers were using a specific word that signaled a rebellious, shining divine being, likely a member of that same divine council we talked about earlier who was practicing forbidden enchantment.
Exactly.
But even with that complex meaning, they still did not call him Satan.
They did not. In fact, nowhere in the entire Old Testament is the Serpent of Eden explicitly identified as Satan.
That's crazy.
It wasn't until the very last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, which, by the way, was written over 1,000 years after Genesis, that an author retroactively connects the dots, explicitly calling the ancient serpent the devil and Satan.
So, if the original text describes a shining one, or even just a snake, where in the world did we get the modern, universally recognized image of the devil? Like the red skin, the goat horns, the hooves, the pitchfork, because that specific description is nowhere to be found in the Bible.
That imagery is entirely extra-biblical.
Wow.
Yeah, as early Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, The church needed a visual way to represent the concept of ultimate evil to a population that was largely illiterate.
Makes sense.
To do this effectively, they looked at the pagan gods of the local cultures they were attempting to convert. They took visual cues from Pan, the Greek god of nature who had goat legs, cloven hooves, and horns.
Okay.
And they incorporated elements from Hades, the god of the underworld, who carried a bident, a two-pronged implement that looks remarkably like a pitchfork.
So it was essentially a massive visual propaganda campaign.
A very strategic one, yes. If you want a population to stop worshiping a familiar pagan nature god, you paint your new religion's ultimate villain to look exactly like him. Over centuries, this synthesized imagery was solidified in church frescoes and stained glass, and was eventually cemented permanently into the Western public consciousness by works of literature like Dante's Inferno in the 14th century.
When you trace it all the way through, the evolution is just staggering. A theological concept born out of the historical trauma of the Babylonian exile to solve a philosophical problem about God's goodness gets retroactively tied to a shining enchanter in Genesis.
Yep.
It then morphs into a Greek god visual mashup for early church campaigns, and now people in the 21st century are experiencing genuine distress over Halloween decorations and plastic toys because of it.
It illustrates perfectly how religious texts and the doctrines built around them are not static. They are living, breathing constructs.
Right.
They evolve based on devastating historical crises, nuanced linguistic translations, and even the practical artistic necessities of a given era.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this right now? We've traced the concept of the ultimate adversary from a celestial prosecuting attorney to a theological scapegoat meant to protect God's reputation, and finally into a psychological mechanism of boundary enforcement wrapped in medieval artwork.
Yeah, and why this matters, whether you consider yourself a devout believer, a strict atheist, or someone who is just insanely curious about human behavior, is that realizing how history, translation, and art shape society's deepest fears, it completely changes how you view culture.
Absolutely.
It changes how you evaluate authority. When you understand the historical architecture of an idea like Satan, you can see the scaffolding behind the major arguments surrounding faith, morality, and control today.
It really pulls back the curtain on how fear is structured and utilized across centuries. And that brings us to a final lingering thought for you to ponder on your own. We've seen how the concept of Satan was historically developed specifically to absorb the blame for the world's evil, essentially to get God off the hook for human suffering. So, what happens to the concept of an all-loving, all-powerful God if you remove Satan from the equation entirely?
Wow.
If the ultimate adversary is just a constructed scapegoat who is left holding the bag for all the suffering in the world?
A profound question that strikes at the very core of theological philosophy.
The murky waters of theology, right back where we started. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. See you next time.